I hear about, slow down, phone. This is something I hear about a lot without naming names, is when you receive a large gift, it seems like that person would sometimes want a seat at the table and want some say in how the organization is doing some part of its mission. And I can see how in certain ways that would make sense. If I give $1 million to Coastal Horizons and I really want them to expand their medically assisted treatment medication, that doesn't strike me as being immediately unethical. However, if I give $1 million to Coastal Horizon and I say, you got to fire this person and that person, you got to fire Kenny House, get him out of there. I love Kenny. I'm just saying, use this as an example. So how do you guys run into that? And if so, how do you deal with it?
I used to run into that in education institutions in terms of scholarship funds. And, I'll give a $2,000 donation to the scholarship fund, but I want it to go to my niece for her tuition, which is very outside the lines and the boundaries. And I think kind of something similar to what I was thinking about adding after Beth finished earlier, I think kind of the other tenets that I think about are transparency and integrity, and just that when we ask for money for something, that's what we actually use it for. And that when we, and that you just have an honest conversation with a donor like that. I mean, with the scholarship fund example, that the conversation is turned to, we would love for you to give to the scholarship fund, but those funds are distributed through this process and your funds will be distributed the same way that all of the others are. And we hope that your niece qualifies for what she needs. Or you can pay her tuition and not get a tax credit. And so I think it's the willingness to have honest conversations, and then to do what you say you're going to do with the money, and to hold the whole organization accountable to that. I mean, to me, that's one of the challenges that comes with being in the development seat is, you don't always have control over the whole process. And so being willing to hold, when necessary, which hopefully isn't often, but hold finance people and executive directors and board members also accountable for the decisions they're making, and kind of reminding the whole organization of those principles that we have signed on to as part of AFP.
A related question, I think, for me is, we've seen this a lot, and I'll use a specific example. During the pandemic, there was some real tension that we reported on between Good Shepherd and the county in terms of how things were being handled. And no one wanted to publicly talk about it, which makes my life as a journalist very difficult. But I was very sympathetic that this was just a lot of people trying to do the right thing who didn't agree on what that right thing was. And I think when you've got a nonprofit that gets government money, often that community organization knows a particular issue really well, whether that's homelessness or substance abuse or housing. And there seems to me to be a fine line you have to walk when you get money from especially local government, because one, you're going to run into that person in the supermarket, and two, that seems to be a very sort of intimate kind of funding, as opposed to like a federal grant where it's unlikely you're going to piss off the grant writer at the in Washington, DC. Have any of you guys experienced this? And I'm not asking for specific stories here, but do you think of taking government money as having sort of additional maybe strings, or maybe imposing sort of additional guidelines to how you conduct your organization publicly in terms of how you speak out on social issues? Beth says she has made her grant officer mad. Good for you, I assume.
Well, Ben, I think one of the things that we as fundraisers and our grant writers know is what are the stipulations of this grant if we are going to take it. And those are things that we know prior to applying for a majority of the time. I can tell you at Planned Parenthood, we had a federal grant that limited how we could provide certain services. But the funding from the grant was really great and provided, provided a lot of family planning services to a lot of people at a very low to free cost, but it prohibited us from providing certain care on certain days. And this federal dollars went away. And now we found that we could better serve patients in some aspects without the grant. But at the same time, we also weren't able to offer certain low-cost services. So then it's that catch-22, and the grant is now back and available to us. And we're trying to make the decision of what was the better way to operate to better serve our patients. Was it using this grant that reduced the cost of things, or was it not using this grant that allowed us to practice better patient care? That came out wrong. We provide great patient care, but you all know what I mean. So the restrictions were limited, so we could offer more services to a patient on a certain day. And that's something where, everybody is sort of, that's a decision for the organization to make. But those stipulations going into applying for the grant, I think. I don't know if that helps.
No, it definitely helps. I think there's two things here. There's formal stipulations, which I think, as long as you're a well-run organization, you're aware of them, you know what you can and cannot do. And then I think there are informal stipulations. We've certainly seen certain community groups get funding very quickly from the county and others struggle for a long time. Again, I can name names, but I don't need to. You probably know who I'm talking about. And those don't seem to be the result of formal guidelines. So I mean, in terms of, if you're Coastal Horizons, and I'm not picking on you guys, Coastal Horizons, but obviously there was some tension over the healing place in how the county decided to go with a different operator to sort of push medically assisted treatment to the side. That seemed to be almost a philosophical decision rather than anything, or a financial decision. I don't really know, but it clearly frustrated folks at Coastal Horizons, but they could only go so far. So I'm talking about situations like that. And again, not picking on Coastal Horizons, that was a really high profile. You had a nonprofit that I think, had that been a private company that had been pushed out of a deal, they probably could have raised hell. But being a part of the community, I think, comes with, again, some informal stipulations. So I think that's what I was asking about, how you know that. I know it's not the most savory topic, but it's come up in my line of work, obviously, quite a bit.
And one of the things I think about quite a lot, and it's interesting with the city council elections and mayoral election coming up, how often I have thought about my vote counting towards what I personally want to see in our city, and how I want the outcome of the election to be able to benefit my organization. And it's such a fine line that we walk all the time with our relationships with elected officials. So specifically, as it relates to the example that you gave about Good Shepherd in the county, I think, we have to look at people in elected positions as individuals that can certainly help us with our mission. But when it comes to the people within the county or the city that can really help us use our dollars wisely, I think about having those conversations with staff. I have sort of 2 staff members within both of those entities that I regularly communicate with about the impact that our gifts are having. Kristen and I have developed solid relationships with people within the county that we connect with on a regular basis related to the gifts that they've made related to our capital campaign. And it's important that those people understand our progress. But when it comes to answering questions from elected officials, it's a relationship that we have to develop a certain way. And I think of my own ethics that I carry with me related to fundraising in terms of how I develop my relationships with those individuals. I think it's just a very careful and professional relationship that you need to maintain. And I think when you do cross those lines, that's when you get into positions where you can be asked questions like, I want so-and-so to serve on our board, on your board, and you need to make that happen. I mean, that's a conversation that I would not entertain with a public official. And you just have to sort of hold your boundaries there.
Yeah. So a different kind of question. And this has to do with some of you who've been in this business for a while. Those ethical questions about, you know, who you get involved with, who you accept donations from, who serves on your board, as a good example. Has that become more difficult over the last 4 years as things have become increasingly politically divisive? And I ask this, so full disclosure, we've got the chair of the New Hanover County Democratic Party and a Democratic County Commissioner on our board. And so as a journalist, I have to deal with sometimes, frankly, hostile questions about whether or not I'm effectively an organ of the County Democratic Party, which is pretty insulting. But on the other hand, they can point to the board, and what can I say? So, you know, we have to describe how that firewall works and all that. And I think there is a level of vitriol there that wasn't there 5 years ago. And that's just from my own personal experience working for a nonprofit under a board. So have you guys seen that change over the last 5 years, or has it just always been this bad and I'm just wet behind the ears here?
I think that I've been in this business almost 20 years, and I have always had to maintain a very neutral stance, because you are always going to have people on your board that do not have the same political views that you do. I do think that my experience with nonprofit, though, is that we tend to be more, and I'm going to say the dirty word, liberal than most of our board members. So I just, you know, I think that all of us have had to be very careful about what we say, how we say it, what we post, what we don't post. But I do think that I think it's just bubbled more to the surface. It's always been there. That's my opinion.
I think for us,
at the Carousel Center, it's mine. Jen, I think you're muted.
hello. Yeah.
So you brought up,
Hello.
you know, what you post on, you know, I'm assuming social media. How do you guys think about the ethics of your personal life as it sort of inevitably interfaces with your professional life?
No, that's exactly what I'm talking about. My personal email, I am very neutral. As a matter of fact, I've shut it down considerably. I used to be friends with a lot of donors, board members, etc. And I know some people who have two Facebook pages, one for their outward facing and one for, you know, very personal. I've just made mine very, very personal. So that's exactly what I was talking about.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, I'm not like lit up for some reason. I was just going to echo what Lori was saying, especially coming from Friends School of Wilmington, which is super left, if you're calling a spade, to a veteran organization, which, and I wish Bethany was here, she's actually in a meeting. I think you've got two people at the helm who are trying to make it an inclusive organization. There are lots of veterans that look lots of different ways that need to be served in the way that we are serving. But when you say veteran, a lot of times it evokes a certain persona and profile and such. So that's an interesting line that she and I think both walk. And what do you post on? I remember back in June during Pride Month, we had the conversation of, do we come out on our own, meaning our Canines for Services Facebook page, and show support? And we felt it was important, and that we may have lost support on one side, but we were certainly gaining another audience as well in that way. As far as, and I echo Lori with my own views. I have
created sort of a policy in my own head that I will not be friends with board members or donors, especially major donors, who I honestly maybe don't know their political views, but I certainly know my own and don't want to cross a line that way.
And I think to add what Jen's saying, we have definitely gone through the process as we're doing asks or sending out emails where we have written something, whether it's a reflection from a student or especially last summer in the wake of George Floyd and all of those that were really, those experiences that were really impactful to our students who reflected tremendously on it, had some really beautiful work. And we're on podcasts, and we were really proud of them for using their voice and advocating for their communities. And we had people 6 months later come back to us and say, you know, that was a little too left for us. And so for us, keeping in mind, you know, what is in alignment with our mission and vision, but also knowing that our students advocating for themselves is important for us, and them having a voice and being proud of that voice is really important for us. And so if we lose some people along the way, yes, that particular person held on to it for a while, like 6 months, because it really bothered them. And when even the conversation before we sent it out was, do we think this is maybe too far? And we made the decision that we didn't think it was. We thought it was what people needed to hear from us and what was important for us to, you know, make a statement on.
Yeah.
Hey, this
but-
is Stephanie Corrett. I'm with the Coastal Land Trust, Sarah. I just want to commend you and echo your statement about oh gosh. I hope y'all can still hear me. It's getting real straight with your mission. Whether it is, are you taking money from a certain place or a certain donor for a certain reason or not? Or if it is what kind of work you're doing, like making a decision about, are you going to, you know, participate in something? It always has to be mission focused in the nonprofit world. Our mission is not our bottom line. And our mission is where we all focus energy, whether we're program people or whether we're development people. And so I feel like that is like the guiding principle at the core of the whole ethics conversation, and the whole like at the base of every single one of these scenarios and these questions is, how is it mission focused? And that goes back to what Beth was saying, you know, is it good for the community? I think the mission of your organization is meant to be how you organize all of your actions. So that's been kind of bubbling throughout this whole conversation. So
yeah, oh, I agree. So if we have time, I have maybe a practical question, a real world scenario. In September of next year, the Community Endowment Foundation is going to start taking applications for grants. So we're looking at $40-ish million a year, every year. And that can do a tremendous amount of good, but clearly there's going to be a queue of people trying to get those grants in. And I don't, you know, the endowment's run by people. There's personality, so there's relationships. What do you guys think about the ethics involved there in terms of there's going to be some jockeying for that money? So what is the ethical way to go about doing that to try and get a hold of that money, basically?
You know, something that's been bubbling in my head as it relates to those funds specifically is some of our nonprofit organizations in town that are truly community-based and grassroots. You know, as professional fundraisers, I think I would hope that all of our organizations are in a good place to ask for those funds, right? You know, I can envision all of us going to those meetings. We're paid to do that, right? That's our job. You know, those of us who have written grants before, and that would probably include all of us, we'll be well positioned to ask for that money. Some of us have relationships with people on that board, and if we don't, we're probably looking to establish them. So we're good, right? But I think about some of the smaller nonprofits in town that are truly grassroots and don't have professional fundraisers on their board or on their staff. And I think to myself, what responsibility do I have as a member of the community to support their efforts? Do I join a board so that I can support that? It's just something that has a conversation that's been happening in my head and is challenging me ethically as I think about this process sort of starting up. I think as a food bank, we're well positioned to ask for those funds, and I hope that the food bank will be successful in starting some new endeavors as it relates to the endowment. But it does concern me that we have small grassroots organizations in town that also can benefit from those and probably don't have the resources that it takes to be successful in asking for those funds. And I think those are questions that as a community we need to be asking ourselves. Is there a way that we can support them in being positioned to be successful?
I would say, to add on to that, Beth, a transparency on the funders end, from the city, from the county, from the foundation, of not only who's on that board, but how they got to those people that they're funding. What was the criteria? So it's one thing, I mean, I'm a pretty straight shooter. We did not get funding from a county entity, which I understand. I get it. You can't fund everybody, but when asked for reasons why or how my organization could better either serve the community or communicate how to serve the community, it was radio silence. And it was, I'm just curious, who else got that money as a taxpayer in this county? Radio silence. So it's the transparency, I think, Ben, that I am in particular as an organization, but also as a taxpayer in the city and the county, want to help encourage ethical behavior.
Yeah, I've been pointing as an example of the way Cape Fear Collective handled the county's rollout of the ARP funding. And this was an interesting situation because it seemed like there was a little bit of a hot potato where there was, $750,000. And for whatever reason, the county didn't feel comfortable directly distributing that. And they sort of handed it off to CFC, who didn't seem super comfortable directly handing it out. So they created their own board. But once they finally did that, there was apparently, at least internally, there was kind of a scoring system and a rubric. And I think, if CFC was a public body, you could do a public records request for those scores, and the public could kind of see, all right, here's exactly how we value these community organizations. And yeah, here's why this group got this amount of money, and so on and so forth. But I don't know if there's that level of transparency right now. And I don't know if the community endowment will have that level of transparency. It's something that the press has been fighting them over. And I think we may have kind of lost that battle, just to be totally candid. Well, that covers a lot of my questions for you guys. My takeaway here is that there isn't like an Old Testament code here. It's more, you're just trying to frame things in terms of, what's actually good for the community and the mission, and maybe not good for the bottom line if you have to choose one or the other. Is that a fair, like, one-line synopsis here?
I think that's fair. We may not always be on the same page with every board member and every staff member and every executive director that we've worked for over time. But I think it is our job to sort of play that role that you described within our organizations. And hopefully 99% of the time we will come out with a truly a decision within the organization that will truly be good for both the donor and our organization. That's the perfect world we seek.
Fair
Ben,
enough.
I'm curious about what your line in the sand is ethically. You know, we all, even though you're talking about journalistic ethics, I think oftentimes we are seeking, you know, the same thing, and that is the best information for the community in your case, and for our case, the best outcome for the community. So I'm curious about what your line in the sand is.
That's a good, I mean, that's the hardest question, right? I think for me, it's you've got to weigh the public good versus the damage you're doing to your own newsroom's ability to keep doing the job, which sounds a little Manichaean or Machiavellian, but it's true. I mean, there are times when we have, not done stories because it would have provided a little bit of titillation for the public, but it wouldn't have really moved any social needles. It wouldn't have moved any conversations forward, and it probably would have blown up a couple bridges that would prevent us from doing good reporting in the future. And there are times when, you have to blow up those bridges. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, when I was at Port City Daily, we heard about a Mexican woman who was working at a restaurant. It was the end of the shift, and if you've ever worked in restaurants, you know that sometimes people make themselves little shift meals and stick them aside in coolers. So she's on camera. She opens the cooler, and there's a little salad in there. It's like a fruit salad. So she grabs it and she takes it home. And to her misfortune, it ended up belonging to the boss's wife, the owner's wife. And according to the owner, the wife got very upset. So he called the police and reported theft. And because the woman was here illegally, she was sent to a deportation center in Atlanta, which is basically an overcrowded prison, where she had been for months. Now she has children who are legally in the country, and so this ended up being a nightmare. So basically, for accidentally taking a $12 salad, she was, her family was torn apart. So think what you want to think about it, but we were definitely going to report on it. But the restaurant owner was an advertiser, and not a small advertiser. And so I ended up having an uncomfortable conversation with our general manager, who had secured this account and had a personal relationship with the owner. Basically, not saying, but saying, "Can you kill this story?" And the answer was no. And it actually ended up kind of working out okay, in that through that personal relationship, I was able to convince the owner to talk to us and go on the record and be part of the story, which I don't think anyone from, the CNN or Fox decided to do. They just ripped the headline and said, either you're anti-immigration and this was a kind of a hateful victory story, or, you have some empathy for immigrants and this was a horror story. But neither of them bothered to talk to the owner. So we kind of leaned on that personal relationship and said, look, you're going to get absolutely blowtorched by MSNBC here. But at least if you talk to us, you will get a fair shake. You will get your say in the story. And he did. He sat down with us and he talked to us, and he talked about how he regretted it, and how he had actually, this is something we would not have known otherwise, is he actually went to the court. We were able to verify this. He went to the courthouse and had the charges dropped. And of course, by that point, it was too late. He was, it could have been all for show, but he seemed legitimately upset that his snap reaction had caused so much damage. And that's a way better story. It's a way fuller, rounder story. It's still a sad story, but it ended up being, the community knows more and understands what happens better because that guy went on the record. And I think that was a good outcome from that scenario that could have gone very bad. It could have just involved me and the GM punching each other in the newsroom, or some other situation. But that was a tricky one, because we knew for a fact that we were going to take a financial hit, and especially as a still somewhat fledgling digital company, advertising is all we have. So, and losing one big account could mean the newsroom shuttered. So it wasn't really theoretical. It was very real. But so that's a long roundabout way of saying, you basically, it's not just, we're not, philosopher kings where we just live by, if it can be destroyed by the truth, it must be destroyed by the truth. We do have to weigh in, are there stories that we can't do because that would be the last story we did? Or because it would be a minor victory, but it would be a Pyrrhic victory. And I think every newsroom has to deal with that. You look at the way WECT backed off of covering the hospital sale, or Cape Fear Community College, which we've had our own run-in with recently. So yeah, those two questions, kind of, you hold them hand in hand, and one is very noble and one is sort of very, practical, but you have to do both.
Not to get too far off the ethics conversation, but I do want to thank you for your coverage of the sexual assault stories that were happening. Needing to cover the New Hanover County School Board tenaciously, which was something I was disappointed didn't happen in the Star News newsroom. And I know that was probably a very difficult balance for Port City Daily to do, and WECT stayed on it as hard as they could, I thought. But it was disappointing to see the Star News sort of take a back seat in that story, and it's ongoing. And, as we've talked about today, it is in the best interest of our community for there to be transparency in that story. And for those of us who have personal attachments to it, it's even more difficult to stay. I think about my position with the food bank and wanting to be, likable and, level-headed, and then having to sort of have difficult conversations with people in positions of power within the school district. It's just sort of a mess. It's really messy, but I want to thank the Port City Daily for their coverage, and you personally, Ben.
Well, I appreciate that. And there was, again, to go back to, the limits of what you can say, there were certainly, especially early on, there were people who canceled their subscriptions. For a while we were doing news lines on the Penguin, and we had people call the Penguin and say that they weren't going to listen to the Penguin anymore because they didn't want to hear this stuff. And those were also tough conversations with the GM about what were we actually doing, and was this just sensationalist, or was this actually important? And again, every newsroom struggles with that, and I am slightly heartened to see that. And actually met with Pam Sander and Sherry from Star News a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about this. And I do think they are trying to course correct. They are under pretty absurd corporate pressure to do various things, but yeah, I'm hoping that they're trying to right the ship over there.
Do we have any other questions or any topics that we want to discuss? We have about 10-15 minutes left.
And one thing that I do want to say, when you did your takeaway, you said there's not really I don't know the word that you used, but I do want to go back to, we do have a code of ethics that we as professional fundraisers are required to follow. And Stacy put a link to what that code, to that code in the chat. And, and it sounds like someone had sent you some questions ahead of time that may have related to exactly what those codes speak to. But, a lot of it is not just what we do with or how we interact with our donors. A lot of it is also related to how we are within the organization, or how we as professional fundraisers, what we do with the information that we have. Donors share very personal things with us oftentimes, and as good stewards and as ethical individuals, we are trusted to hold that information close and to not go blabbing our donors' business across town. So there's other things that go into when you talk about the ethics of fundraising. There's such things, where if a professional fundraiser leaves the organization and goes to another organization, it's not their donors. So they have to be very careful when they start talking with people who they know who were giving to the organization where they used to be, and not poach them and try to get them to leave one organization, because donors don't give to individuals, they're giving to the organization. But as a professional fundraiser, sometimes it's hard to remember that, right? We sometimes have a tendency of saying my donor, and it's not my donor, it's the organization's donor. So there's many levels of ethics that go into fundraising that is not directly tied to a donation. And I think that's really important for all of us to remember as a part of this conversation today.
Yeah, that's a good insight. I hadn't thought about it that way. And I suppose I do. I mean, since I go through the county and the city budgets every year and look at the frankly kind of paltry amount of money that they give out, it does sometimes strike me as a zero-sum game where there could be some competitiveness. So especially if you went from one organization to another, I could see the pressures to bring some of those donors with you could be intense. I know that coming from Port City Daily to WHQR, we had a newsletter list of about 15,000 people. And these are not donors, but they kind of are, because a lot of them were also subscribers who probably have similar interests in journalism that could be served by WHQR. So the temptation to steal, I'll just be honest, the temptation to steal that mailing list from Port City Daily and use it for WHQR was intense. I had to force my hand over to the delete button off of my computer.
I'm just going to get all sappy for a hot second and just say publicly, as I think I'm on my third year in this group, I personally find everyone that I've interacted with more than willing to help to share, which doesn't mean they're sharing their donors or their personal information, but the insights, or, hey, there's this grant that you might be a good fit for. So I would hope that that's how other AFP chapters are, but I'm very, very appreciative of our little chapter.
Thank you, Jen. I think that's kind of the perfect way to wrap us up for the day on a high note. And thank you so much, Ben. We appreciate you being able to facilitate this discussion. It's always, I think, kind of one of the highlights of our monthly meetings. So.
Well, I was happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well,
Thank you, Ben.
all. Everybody have a great day.
Good to see everybody.
Good to see everybody. Have a great day.